Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today, Josh and I are going to discuss an article entitled 4 Things About Anger Everyone Should Know. The author is Nick Wignall, or Wignall. I'm probably getting that wrong, Josh, but we can apologize to Nick at a later time after this. It's a very interesting article that we wanted to share with everyone because anger, sort of as maybe a larger emotion, is something that can occur in tennis with players because tennis is very frustrating and it can bring up, some negative or unproductive emotions. So I'm going to list out these 4 things, and then Josh and I are going to dive into each one of them. So number 1, anger is not a negative emotion. It is a pleasurable one. I think that's a really interesting one for us to discuss. Number 2, anger is different than aggression. Number 3, excess anger comes from excess thinking. And number 4, venting makes you more angry, not less, which is kind of in line with a past episode that we did about venting anger. So Josh, let's start off with the first one, because I think, as we were discussing earlier, this was one that really kind of made some sense to us, I think, right? Anger is not a negative emotion. It is a pleasurable one. So when you read that and read this section, what came to mind for you?
Yeah, I would say intrigue at the start. I think most people, myself included, traditionally think of anger, in a negative way. Think of it as a negative emotion, and I think often that is because the way that anger is expressed, and I think that's related to aggression, which is actually the second, the second point here. But the way that anger is often expressed looks, it looks negative, right? But the point that's being made here is that, often what ends up happening is when we express anger, that makes us feel right about a situation. So maybe we get cut off, maybe we're driving, somebody cuts us off, and we get angry. And that sort of sends a message to ourselves that they're in the wrong and we're in the right in a situation. Or maybe on the tennis court, an opponent makes a bad line call, and or what we perceive to be a bad line call. And again, that sends us some sort of signal that they're wrong about a situation, we're right, or we are, we're justified to be feeling this way. So it's that, or maybe we get angry because of the way that we're playing, and we're frustrated by the way that we're playing. But again, it's sort of sending that message or that signal that we are capable, we're capable of playing better, or we are actually a better player than what we're showing. And what ends up happening is, because this feeling of anger can actually be pleasurable, that can be self-rewarding. It can end up causing us to, to feel this in the future, and to sort of, it can end up being a cycle. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I like the examples that they used in the article. They talked about people that will watch the news, and they will get frustrated by what they see in the news. They don't necessarily they're not necessarily taking action to, to try to impact things, but they'll get frustrated by it, which again just sort of perpetuates itself. But yeah, I thought that was very interesting, and I thought that it relates to probably a lot of experiences that people have on the court. And I think they made an interesting point as well, that when we, when we can think back to moments of anger, right? And actually that feeling itself, is that necessarily a negative feeling, or is it actually, in a certain way, is it positive because we're actually sort of getting rid of maybe the negative emotions that we're actually feeling in that moment? So I thought I thought that was very interesting, and I think again people will link to the article in the show notes, and I think we would encourage people to read that as well, because yeah, I think generally anger is seen in a negative way, seen as a negative emotion, but I think they make a really strong argument that it's not.
Yeah. So, like you said, Josh, we typically think of anger maybe in sort of its utility more. That, yeah, it's negative, it's not productive. And I would even say, negative might not be the right term. We often throw that around, but it's generally not productive. Some
Hmm.
people can channel it into something productive, but I would say that's the minority. But when, the author stated that it was pleasurable, it just got me to think, yeah, you know what? I think he might be right about that, because put ourselves in that self-righteous situation, and maybe it's not even in a tennis context, or maybe it is. Maybe it's after a match, and you're talking about it, and you're talking about it with someone who's also validating everything you're saying. And it's really hard to break that conversational loop, to step out of it and then look at it in a more productive way. You can be maybe complaining or coming up with a bunch of excuses for why you lost. And then somebody's validating that, and you're going over and over. It's almost like even like gossip. Gossip is not a a particularly productive activity, but it can go on for a while. You get sucked in
Can
to
be
it.
rewarding. Yeah.
Yeah, like you said, self-rewarding. And because it's that, it can be hard to break the loop. And if we're going through this even on the court, to me, there's like, oh, this is great, because we want to be aware of anger, or maybe some of the deeper emotions on that, to understand that we could get stuck in this loop. Therefore, we're not really doing anything about the match. We're distracted by whatever this thing is. And certainly you mentioned being self-righteous, Josh. Let's say we got a line call that we perceive to be bad. Now you can feel like, yeah, I'm the one in the right, and I can't believe he or she did that. And that can then perpetuate, and it can be very hard to get out of it. And they just get back to, all right, next point. So it's like it's this pleasurable, almost addictive type of thing that can occur. And again, the reason I really like this point is to help us all recognize that putting your anger aside is perhaps easier said than done. It requires some training and skill and awareness of what is going on. And I think that this point helps bring some more understanding to the dynamics of that emotion. Because I think for me, Josh, I would say that anger generally is, non-productive. It has really very little utility for the player in a match. Now that can be changed if it is channeled forward into, all right, what are you going to do now? Very often it's not. Very often it's brought back into the past. So I think, if you're listening to this, can you think about, what is anger as an emotion really serving for you? Is it helping you just to lay the blame with somebody else, to make excuses? Is there some other sort of psychological need that anger is fulfilling for you in this moment? And really try to think about that more, so that this doesn't take over your thinking, while you're competing, because it very likely will lead to poor decisions, poor focus, maybe a lowering of your desire to win, etc. So I just want to see if you have any further comments, Josh.
No, I think this is a theme that shows up in throughout these 4 points. But I think awareness is it couldn't be more critical here, right? If we're aware of the anger that we're feeling, and again, maybe not being judgmental about that, but just more so just noticing the emotion itself, then then I think we can, and then I think it's easier to recognize in the moment, what's actually happening. I think what ends up happening is oftentimes people feel that feel anger, and they are sort of taken by it. They're taken by it, that they're not aware of what's happening, and they end up becoming reactive, right? They end up throwing their racket, or they end up yelling at themselves, or getting into a sort of confrontation with their opponent that maybe they wouldn't have chosen. And yeah, I think if we can be aware, if we can catch ourselves, and we can talk about maybe different strategies to do that, to slow things down, to catch ourselves, to hopefully not make a decision that we would end up regretting. If we can be aware of it in the moment, then I think it's a lot easier to process it in a way that we will feel proud about ultimately.
Right. And so perhaps point number two will help us with that. So point number two is anger is different than aggression. So give me your, initial impressions on this one.
Yeah. So, I mean, anger is the emotion itself, and then aggression is the behavior that often comes after that emotion. So, they give different examples of, aggressive physical behavior, aggressive verbal behavior, even aggressive mental behavior. So, they give an example of, let's say, a basketball game, where maybe, a basketball game, somebody gets fouled, or someone gets, sort of knocked over to the ground, and they respond physically. We see this in hockey quite a bit, where somebody gets, the end result is a fight, but it doesn't start there. It often starts with somebody gets checked into the boards, and then they shove back, and then the next thing you know, it's multiple people are fighting. But so that was the first example, aggressive physical behavior. Second one was aggressive verbal behavior, where maybe you respond back to a comment that somebody else made to you in an aggressive way, maybe attacking them in some way. And then aggressive mental behavior, which is more about thoughts or ruminations, in maybe maybe in an aggressive way. So yeah, I think that we want to be able to differentiate between that emotion, between anger and recognizing that anger, and then differentiating between the behavior that comes next, the aggression. And they talk about this in this point, but also in other points, that we can be able to validate it, right? We can validate that anger, validate that emotion, rather than deciding that we're going to respond, rather than deciding that we're going to react in a less than ideal way. So they made the point, we want to validate the anger and recognize it, but we want to control that aggression. And again, we can talk more about ways to do that. But yeah, I think that by being able to acknowledge and validate that feeling, it makes it a lot easier to not take that next step and be aggressive.
And I want to talk about validate a little bit more, especially when we get to the third point, because I think in a tennis match, you can often make an argument that the emotion actually is not particularly valid, because you might be associating more importance to something than it really is. So, for example, getting mad about losing a point to go down love 15, I could make a pretty coherent argument that that's kind of dumb, given the way the sport is scored, right?
Yep.
So maybe learning to, there's going to be that part, is understanding better uh, when we should, maybe when anger could be more valid than others. But I think it's really also about accepting that this emotion has occurred. And when you accept it rather than fight it, it's easier to dismiss it. I think we find that when we try to fight our own feelings or emotions, it becomes more difficult than it is to like, all right, yeah, not feeling great about this, but okay, again, what's the utility of this emotion if it translates into aggression? I recently saw a match in which a player got very upset about a line call, and it translated into much more aggressive play after that, which had its ups and downs. There were a couple great points, and then there were a couple of shots that were totally reckless. But the player, because of the anger, went away from his normal game, right? Sort of started to make bad decisions. Some of those bad decisions worked out. Most of them didn't.
Mhm.
So we have to be careful about letting anger now dictate behavior and dictate that aggression. So I think this is a really good point because, like you said earlier, Josh, awareness is really key. And being aware of the fact that this is an emotion, but if we let it go on and it becomes a behavior, that becomes a real problem, whether that's a tennis match or just life in general. I mean, everybody talks about, especially in corporate environments, never respond to an email when you're upset or a text. It almost never is the right thing to do. What do? You take a break, take a breath. Like you said, we can talk some strategies at the end, but I think understanding that anger can lead to aggression, can lead to aggressive behavior is a key point that everyone should know, and that, how that might even manifest for themselves on the court. What have you noticed when you've gotten angry? Maybe it's lost a little bit of control. What did that lead to in terms of behavior? Did it lead to more aggressive behavior, like you said, in one of those ways, physical, verbal, mental, etc.?
Yeah, and I think there's sometimes you hear a rebuttal where people will bring up an example of, let's say, John McEnroe, and they'll say, well, he's able to, he was so great at being able to get angry and use that to his advantage. And I don't know, was that actually the case? Perhaps
At
in
times,
certain
but there were
moments
certainly moments where it was not.
where it boiled over and it impacted him negatively. So yeah, no, I think that, and I think maybe he's the exception, and then maybe, but I think for the vast, vast, vast majority of people, that's not the case. When you're experiencing aggression, when you're, when you're acting in these ways, yelling at yourself, throwing your racket, even mentally, even when your thoughts are sort of aggressive to yourself, to your opponent, to the situation, it doesn't tend to help. I think for the vast majority of people, it, it holds you back from being in control of the situation. I think when you're feeling that way, or when you're behaving in that way, I should say, you are not going to be in control of yourself, which it makes it very tough to be in control of the situation. So, yeah, no, I think that, and I would ask people that are listening, when you're angry and when you're, taking it to that next level of aggression, do you generally play well during those times? I would be pretty surprised if for most people the answer is no. And I think, Brian, actually you brought up a great point in, I think it was a couple months back in one of our episodes, but you said, for people that think that they play better in those situations, why don't they just intentionally do it? Why don't they just intentionally, get themselves angry, get themselves into that state of mind? And I think the reason is the truth is that, people don't tend to play better in those situations. Maybe we can think of one or two examples where you felt angry and then you felt so motivated and driven and focused and ended up winning. But I don't think that's the vast majority of the times for just about anybody.
Right. Yeah, because in that situation, anger is almost like a wild horse. You're riding this wild horse. You really don't know where it's going. It might end up someplace good, but more often than not, it doesn't. And yeah, if you can channel it forward, okay, good for you, but most players cannot. Okay, point number 3, excess anger comes from excess thinking. All right, your thoughts, Josh.
Yeah, I think that again they make the point that, everyone gets angry. It's normal, it's healthy, but you know there's certain situations where, it feels that the frequency or the intensity is sort of out of whack or out of proportion with the circumstances. And then it's, how you sort of respond or how you're behaving that really is the issue. But they talk about how, the cause of these emotions is our thoughts. So the cause of the anger itself is our thought. It's not the fact that somebody cut us off in traffic. It's how we're viewing that. It's our interpretation of that. And he talks about how, two of the big culprits here are rumination and then unrealistic expectations. And to me, two main things came up. One was actually a speech that we have talked about by David Foster Wallace, who was a former tennis player, actually wrote a lot about tennis. And you can check out some of his work where he's written about tennis, among other things. But in this speech, which is called "This Is Water," he talks about this. He talks about, the person cuts you off, or you're in line at the grocery store and it seems to be taking forever. And in those moments, can you be really aware of how you're viewing the situation? Right? Am I just saying, "Oh, that person's an idiot because they cut me off in traffic," or are we jumping to conclusions, making judgments about the situation? Or can we maybe take a step back? Can we zoom out? Can we understand, what there might be different, that person that cut me off might have completely different life circumstances. Maybe they're going through a lot right now. Maybe they have, family issues, or maybe, maybe there's things that are going on that we have no idea, right? And we're casting judgment, where we are allowing ourselves to get angry based on the way that we're thinking about the situation. So again, would encourage people to check out that speech and some of his other work. But that came to mind, and also just, mindfulness, right? Recognizing the nature of our thoughts, recognizing that when we can meditate, when we can stop and really try to notice and observe our thoughts, we start to notice that by nature they are, tend to be pretty out of control. We tend to have thoughts pop up all the time. We tend to be judgmental, critical, things like that. And again, it comes from us being able to notice it and be aware of it. But I think if we can recognize that the reason, or one of the main reasons why we're feeling angry, is because of those thoughts itself and because of how we're deciding to interpret a situation, then I think we can do something about it, right? We can recognize, okay, this is because of my thoughts, because of how I'm viewing the situation. Okay, maybe I want to think about it a little bit differently. Maybe I want to talk to myself a little bit differently about this, and recognizing that again, that will lead to the consequence of, maybe different sorts of emotions, or maybe different sorts of actions and behaviors from there. So yeah, those were some of the things that came up from when I read that particular section. When you think about this third point, this excess anger comes from excess thinking, what came to mind for you?
You mentioned two terms that were in this section: rumination and expectation. So I want to talk about rumination first. So rumination is kind of like dwelling on the past, maybe dwelling on what should have happened, or what I should have done, or could I have changed. And the more that we ruminate, maybe it gets back to the first point about the pleasure piece. We get stuck in that cycle. And it made me think of the work of Dr. Richard Young. So Dr. Richard Young is a coach, he's a sports scientist. He's worked through, I think, 11 now different Olympic cycles with different teams. He was an Olympic athlete himself. And he has done a lot of work on what differentiates, let's put this in Olympic terms, what differentiates people who have won medals many times versus those who have won maybe once or never. And one of the distinctions between the people who are continually successful at the top level versus others is this idea of rumination versus decision. So he says that, novice performers, mediocre performers ruminate. They dwell often on what went wrong, what they should have done, etc. Where top level performers don't do that. They're in the moment and they're thinking about what they're going to do next. They're deciding on what the right course of action is. And this is almost a form of, Josh, like stuff we've talked about before, problem thinking versus solution thinking. And we're always looking to transition to decision, to action, etc. So I wanted to bring that point up as for everyone listening, perhaps some motivation to shift away from, being mediocre in terms of this and being more elite. To not ruminate over what just happened and simply move on. As tough as that may seem, it's the right thing to do. And the more you learn it, the better. And you mentioned some techniques for doing that, becoming more aware of your thoughts through mindfulness, breathing exercises, routine. One thing I've been working on with a lot of players on the court is their self-talk and saying it out loud. Committing to a script out loud can get you to now focus on deciding what you want to do in that next moment. Then the other word was expectations. And I think it's Buddhist principle, Stoic principle, that expectations are the root of all suffering. So we have to make sure, as difficult as it is, that we're not bringing unrealistic expectations. Maybe we're keeping our expectations low, perhaps, or maybe we're coming to the situation with no expectations. And we simply want to just have fun, learn, try to become better, etc. Rather than kind of almost initially saddling ourselves with a problem before we even have a real problem on the court. And so the more that we think about these things, yes, then potentially the more frustrated or angry or annoyed that we can become. So I think if we can deal with, as players, rumination and learning not to ruminate, and then also learning to deal with expectations, because expectations are typically on things that are not fully within our control. Can we understand that? And then shift back to what we can fully control. We can't control our thoughts. Like you said, anybody who's done any sort of meditation knows that, because your mind is constantly wandering and jumping around. So, but what can we control? Hey, we can control our response to that. We can accept it. We can then make a decision about what we want to do. So I thought this was really good, and it also brings some, other practical science into play here in terms of the differences between mediocre performers and those who are elite and continually successful.
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Josh. Please.
Go ahead. No. I think that piece about acceptance is really, really key here. And I think for both of those two pieces about rumination and unrealistic expectations, I think it relates to both of those. I think, if we can if we can get to that point of acceptance, which is not always easy to do, sometimes it seems to happen in an instant, but, sometimes a little bit tougher. But if we can accept a situation, whether that's that line call that was made 3 points ago, whether that was, whether that's something else entirely, if we can accept a situation, that often leads to us not continuing to think about it and wrestle with it and ruminate over it. And then also the expectations piece, right? I think if we can accept that our opponent is going to make mistakes sometimes, with maybe, let's say, if we're sticking with that line call example, maybe we can accept that they will make some bad calls or some incorrect calls, or what we perceive to be some incorrect calls, right? Maybe those are intentional, maybe those are unintentional. But I think if we can accept that, then it's a lot easier to handle that in the moment. I think if we can accept that we will miss some easier shots, that then it becomes a lot easier to handle that in the moment. Then maybe we're able to process that anger that can still come a little bit easier, right? So if we have more realistic expectations, if we're able to accept that, accept the nature of how we are and how our opponent is and how the sport is, again, sort of those 3 levels of tennis IQ. If we can be accepting of all that and and have more realistic expectations, then in the moment when things happen, we are going to be more equipped to handle it in a better way.
For sure. All right, we've reached point number 4. Venting makes you more angry, not less. So we did do an episode on this, Josh, but what were your thoughts on the author's perspective here?
So we did an episode on this. It was episode 152. I looked that up before we started recording. But yeah, and we talked about this then, that there's this idea that when we're angry, we want to let it out, right? We want to let it out. We want to express that somehow. But it's interesting that the research really shows that not only is that not effective, that backfires. So yeah, I thought that was definitely interesting that people want to vent to feel better ultimately about the situation, but that often doesn't end up working. He also makes the point that he again differentiates between venting and validating. With the idea that venting, we're just trying to let it out, again, which research shows is not effective. But validating, on the other hand, is effective. Validating, we are, again, I'll use the same word, accepting an emotion. We're acknowledging the situation, and we're acknowledging how we're feeling about that situation, and you know and yeah, I think when we can do that, when we can validate a situation, we're able to move on a lot quicker. When we're able to more so observe the emotion, validate that emotion tends to fade away maybe a little bit faster. So yeah, I like that comparison between the two, and I think yeah, I think that that's something that we can all strive to do, to try to be able to yeah, validate anger as well as other emotions that we're having, um, which is not always easy to do. I think sometimes, and I think I can think back to my own experiences. Sometimes when we have certain emotions, whether it's anger, whether it's frustration, whether it's sadness, whatever it may be, it's uncomfortable. It can certainly be uncomfortable. So, validating that, sitting with that, recognizing that maybe can be unappealing. But I think once we start being able to do that, we recognize that it really is, it really is a more useful approach.
I really like how you're kind of juxtaposing the validation with the venting, because I could maybe come back at you, Josh, and say, well, what about Novak Djokovic? Because there have been a few videos that have circulated more recently about how he is processing this, right? Because we've all seen him, destroy a racket or two, or a dozen, and yet he seems to be okay with that, more or less. And when you listen to him talk about it, Josh, he's actually using a lot of the terms that you used. Yes, he might break a racket, smash it to bits. But when he's actually describing what's going on for himself, he uses, I believe, the word acceptance, accepting that he's feeling this way. And that for him, through that acceptance, he's able to shift right back to full focus onto what he wants to do. So, like a lot of things, not always simple to describe what's actually happening. Do we recommend that everybody go out there and start smashing their racket? No, most of us don't get them for free, and they're very expensive, clearly. But most of us are not. When we do that, when we're venting that anger, we're not accepting of it. We're not validating why we feel that way. We're just letting the emotion lead to that aggressive behavior, which probably leads to more aggressive behavior, etc. So, Djokovic is actually showing here maybe some elite level skill in his ability to be distracted and then get back to full focus really quickly. That's, again, he's at a level mental skills wise that most people are not. So it's hard to copy that.
Hmm.
I think it's good to understand maybe what he's doing. And I think his explanation is reasonable, although it sometimes comes off as like a rationalization of what he's doing, because I don't think it's necessarily necessary for him to be smashing rackets, because there are plenty of players who don't, right? Rafael Nadal has never broken a racket in his professional career and has a similar number of titles. Not as many, but a similar number. Pretty good. Um, so I did want to just throw that out there, because some people might say, hey, well, what about Djokovic? Because he does break a lot of rackets and has done so, even more so in the last few years than maybe like during some of his better streaks of play. Um, but to get back to episode 152, I think we presented a very strong case for why we should not vent anger, but really distinguish, as you said, what is venting versus validating? What is venting versus accepting, and understanding that piece, so that we can go back to full focus. Because in some way, this is all about distraction control. You are distracted by something that is bringing an emotion forward for you. And how can you get back to full focus? Get back to what you're going to do next. Because tennis is, more so than most sports, it's always about what you're going to do next, because you're never out of it. No clock. No, this is the last round of whatever we're doing. You're still in it. And so it's up to you to kind of to stick with that. So just any last thoughts on this point, Josh, or any of the other ones?
Yeah, and I think actually with Djokovic, and I think that's an interesting point. He, I think, would also acknowledge that he doesn't want to be always doing that. I don't think that's necessarily something he always chooses to do. And I think he's acknowledged, he wants to be, a role model, and not necessarily always doing that. And it doesn't always happen, but I think that there are certainly notable cases of it. Um, but I think, yeah, when it does happen, it seems to almost be a reset for him.
Yeah, it's almost like a yellow light routine, right? Because now he gets to take a break.
Exactly, exactly. No, it's true. And actually, we saw it with Alcaraz. We saw it with Alcaraz recently, which we hadn't seen before, but he completely destroyed one of his rackets in the recent Masters tournament in Cincinnati. So, again, are Brian and I encouraging that for people as a, and saying that venting is recommended? No. In fact, the opposite. But I think we can think about these examples of athletes who have done it, and where it seems to have served a purpose for them in that moment. However, you're playing with fire. You're certainly playing with fire in that moment, and you're playing sort of with that fiery emotion, you could say. Um, and choosing aggression, choosing to respond in that sort of way. So I think, yeah, instead of that, yeah, can we validate and recognize, what, I'm feeling angry right now, I know I'm capable of something more, but not taking it to that next level, not choosing to respond in a way where not only are we not going to be proud of how we ended up conducting ourselves, but we're not, that's not going to lead us to, that's not, you know, generally going to help us perform better now and in the future, right? Instead, we want to build the skills and use our mental skills, which, we can talk about a little bit here, to be able to move on, right? I think, to me, one of the biggest, one of the biggest ways um, to help us process emotions like anger is to be able to just slow things down. You brought up the workplace example of not responding to an email or text message when we're angry, which I think is just good advice in general. Give it a little bit of time, slow things down, wait until you can, think through what you want your response to be, so you can respond rather than just react instinctively to a situation. And I think the same is true, in a tennis context. If we can slow things down, and I think our breath is probably the best way to do that. If we can manage to slow things down, we manage to give ourselves that chance to choose what that response looks like. Um, and, instead of just sort of reacting with that first thing that crosses our mind. But I think the breath gives us that space to do that. It gives us sort of that space to hopefully be a little bit more in control of the situation.
I was at a tournament recently, UTR event, very high level, like kind of like 9-0 plus UTR event, and watching a match. And, very good players, probably, 10 plus UTR level playing match. And one of them was, missing some volleys. And every time he missed a volley, Josh, he would, loudly exclaim, "I always am missing these volleys. You're supposed to be a volleyer." Like all this very sarcastic talk. Probably happened 10 to 12 times, that kind of anger coming out through maybe verbal like aggression, right? Now this player he's a very skilled player. He ended up losing the match, and sort of the most frequent description by others of this player was not about his skill. I mean, there was some mention, yeah, really clean ball striker, et cetera, et cetera. But the predominant image that was left, because he was venting his anger, was what a head case. Now, is that something that we all want to be described as? Because we're venting our anger, because we think that that's what we're supposed to do, whether it's racket, tapping, smashing, or loud commentary, or being super sarcastic with yourself. And I think that that's not really what we want to do. That's because we're, the first audience of all of that is ourselves. And that's promoting an image that we don't want to have of ourselves. But everybody else is seeing it. And for those who, are maybe a bit younger and you're going through perhaps the college tennis recruiting process, the last thing you want to do is have a bunch of college coaches get together and describe you as a head case, or immature or something like that. And very often that's the difference between playing at a Division I program and playing at a Division III program. You simply can't play at a high level Division I program and be that way. But, you can get away with it at certain lower levels. And so I think we want to make sure that we're all not projecting that image through venting. Because then we could also say, like Josh, let's say you saw somebody acting that way, but he won his match. You're probably going in like, all right, I feel pretty good that I can probably get in this guy's head. And if I get in his head, then he's gonna start making some bad decisions here. So the venting actually becomes more of a liability more often than not than it is an asset of yours. So
Definitely. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So I don't know if you have anything more on that, but I thought one way we could end this episode, Josh, is to talk a little bit, maybe ask the listeners to think about perhaps what kind of anger they're experiencing and to go deeper with that emotion, through maybe like an emotion wheel, which you could easily look up online. You can Google that. I also have some things that I looked up for different words. But did you want to go back into the venting piece anymore?
Yeah, just one point about what you were saying, and I completely agree, is that you start to build up a reputation, right? When you're acting like that. And I think we can all probably think of people, maybe it's yourself, but I think we can all probably think of people who come to mind when you think about that person that breaks rackets or yells at themselves or acts in that way. I can certainly think of people from my junior career and playing adult matches and college and just sort of each step of the way. And yeah, I think you start to be seen in that way. And I think again we could talk about the importance of maybe what other people are thinking or saying, but also it can certainly hold you back. So I think it's almost like it's a vulnerability, right? I think it can start to be seen as, okay, yeah, this person, they have a great game, but if you can get under their skin, if you can get in their head, they're going to crumble. And I can think back to actually quite a few junior matches where I, was on the other side of that, where I felt that, I sort of stayed solid and certain players that I played against would do that. And actually that was, you know, interestingly enough, that was one of the reasons why I became more interested in the mental side of the game and ended up pursuing this as a career because it when you see that happen, it becomes crystal clear that this sport is more than just forehands and backhands and serves. It's okay, who can handle those emotions? Who can handle those ups and downs? Because again, if we're being realistic, we know those ups and downs are going to happen. We know that the best players in the world barely win more than 50% of their points. So everybody else who's not one of the best players in the world shouldn't expect to win, every point, shouldn't expect to be perfect. Should be realistic and understand that you're going to lose plenty of points and miss easier shots and have situations with opponents where maybe, whatever, all sorts of things are going to happen. And I think if we can go in with expectations of that, and if we can, really try to take steps to be in control of ourselves, and again, we can feel the emotion, we can validate it, we can recognize it, but not behaving in ways that are aggressive, not behaving in ways that are aggressive, not venting it, not letting it out, because once you let it out, it's often really tough to contain it. Yes, we can think about someone like Djokovic, who he can break a racket and then be ready to go, be calm, be focused, dialed in for that next point. Maybe we can think of some other people who've done that. Maybe it's Alcaraz, maybe it's, Alcaraz in that one situation recently, maybe it's McEnroe. But I think it's tough to put the toothpaste back in the tube once you've let it out. So, I think there's different things to think about. But again, we would encourage people to check out this article. I think there's a lot of good takeaways here. And yeah, I think this has been an awesome conversation.
Yeah. And so let's maybe just end with that emotion wheel piece, Josh. An emotion wheel is a means of giving, all of us a way to understand higher level emotions in more granular ways. Because the more granularly we understand our own emotions, the more we can address it appropriately. So when I was thinking about this article, Josh, really 2 or 3 high level emotions came to mind in a particular emotion wheel. So there were anger, disgust, and sadness. That we can feel those things in matches. So, some deeper emotions that we might feel that fall under the anger category could be frustrated, irritated, annoyed, aggravated, humiliated, furious. And maybe one of those, as I'm reading that out, resonates with your own experience on the court. Now, you might not feel disgust all the time, but maybe disgust is a very powerful emotion. It's often one that's used in trying to manipulate how people think, is to get them to feel disgusted about something. But that might happen in tennis. So, under disgust, we might have disappointed, disapproval, judgmental, loathing, embarrassed, contempt, disdain. And then you also might be feeling sad out there. Maybe you're getting crushed. And so what are, some of the more granular emotions of sadness? Shame, despair, again, embarrassed, powerless, vulnerable, guilty, regret, unmotivated. So, yeah, Google, what an emotion wheel is, look at it, and see if you can find some more granular descriptions of how you're feeling, because that might lead to a better approach to what that emotion is and what you can do about it. And so, Josh, any last thoughts on the emotion wheel or other aspects?
No, I think it's really helpful because I think it it can help us label the emotion that we're actually experiencing, right? Okay, well, I feel a certain way, but by being able to look at this, I'm able to sort of start with frustration or whatever it may be, and then actually being able to pinpoint really what is the specific emotion that I'm feeling. And maybe that word doesn't initially come to mind, but when we can look at something like this, it can be a lot easier to to label it and to have a better sense for really what are we feeling.
Right. Fantastic. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes and we'll have a link to the article that we discussed today. If you have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.